The whispered legends surrounding the Covington estate claimed she was a monster, a girl so grotesquely scarred she was forced to hide behind a heavy black veil. But history lied. When the immortal lord of the manor finally lifted that lace, the truth he uncovered changed our world forever. If you dig deep enough into the private archives of the Oxfordshire County Council, past the mundane property disputes and tax records of the year 2018, you will find a heavily redacted medical file belonging to a girl named Penelope Winslow. To the locals of the sleepy, affluent village of Chipping Norton, Penelope was a ghost story. To the elite circles of London's high society, she was a closely guarded, shameful secret. They called her the Gargoyle of Oxfordshire. Penelope was orphaned in the winter of 2004, when a suspicious fire ravaged her family's summer home in the south of France. Her parents, Thomas and Mary Winslow, perished in the blaze. Penelope, then only 6 years old, supposedly survived but was left with catastrophic facial disfigurements. At least that was the official narrative, signed off by Dr. Henry Arris, the private physician on the payroll of Penelope's aunt, Caroline Winslow. Caroline took the traumatized child in, but not out of the goodness of her heart. Thomas had left behind an inheritance worth tens of millions, wrapped in a trust that Caroline could only control if she remained Penelope's legal guardian. And so, Penelope was hidden away in the drafty, oppressive attic of the Winslow Manor. For 14 years, Penelope's life was an endless cycle of psychological torment. Aunt Caroline and her biological daughter Charlotte were ruthless. They conditioned Penelope to believe she was entirely unlovable, a hideous creature who would turn the stomach of anyone who looked upon her. To ensure this, Dr. Arris prescribed a daily, foul-smelling ointment that Penelope was forced to apply to her face and neck. He claimed it was to prevent the burn tissues from necrotizing, but the ointment burned her skin, leaving it perpetually raw, inflamed, and agonizingly tender. She was forbidden from looking in mirrors. There wasn't a single reflective surface left in her quarters. Whenever she was forced to be in the presence of guests, or when she acted as Charlotte's personal maid, she was made to wear a thick, suffocating black lace veil that draped over her head and shoulders, secured with a velvet choker. "It is for their own good, Penelope," Aunt Caroline would sneer, sipping her gin as the veiled girl scrubbed the manor's floors. "You would give the staff a heart attack. You are a tragedy, my dear, a walking nightmare. Be grateful we allow you to exist in civilized society." As Charlotte grew into a stunning, albeit incredibly vain young socialite, Penelope shrank into the shadows. But despite the cruelty, Penelope possessed a sharp mind and a resilient spirit. 3 weeks before her 21st birthday, a turning point occurred. A newly hired scullery maid, a kind-hearted Spanish girl named Maria, accidentally spilled a bucket of soapy water on the floor where Penelope's medicine was kept. The glass jar shattered. Terrified of her aunt's wrath, Penelope swept up the mess and decided to go without the ointment for a few days, until she could confess. But a strange thing happened. Without the daily application of Dr. Arris's chemical cocktail, the agonizing burning stopped. The inflammation subsided. The skin on her face, which had felt tight and ruined for over a decade, began to feel soft, cool, and supple. She still didn't dare remove her veil, conditioned by years of abuse, but a seed of doubt had been planted in her mind. Meanwhile, a storm was brewing in the hidden echelons of European high society. Just 3 miles away from the Winslow Manor sat Covington Keep, an ancient, sprawling Gothic estate owned by the reclusive billionaire Alexander Covington. To the public, Alexander was a venture capitalist with a penchant for extreme privacy. But the old money families, the politicians, the aristocrats, the royals, knew the terrifying truth. Alexander Covington was not a man. He was the sovereign of a shadow society that had ruled from the dark since the Tudor period. He was a vampire. Every half-century, a rare celestial event known to the underground as the blood-moon alignment took place. During this time, the Covington estate opened its heavy iron gates to the wealthiest and most powerful mortal families for a grand gala. It was a morbid, glittering auction. The families would parade their most beautiful daughters before Alexander and his immortal court. If a daughter was chosen as a consort or a blood bride, her family would be granted centuries of unimaginable wealth, political immunity, and power. Charlotte Winslow had been groomed for this exact night her entire life. Aunt Caroline had spent millions on Charlotte's wardrobe, etiquette coaches, and cosmetic enhancements, determined to secure the Winslow family's absolute supremacy by marrying her daughter off to the Vampire King. When the blood-red invitation, sealed with black wax, finally arrived at Winslow Manor, the house descended into a frenzy. Charlotte demanded absolute perfection. She had commissioned a silk, crimson gown from Paris, so heavy with jewels that she needed someone to carry the train. "You're taking the creature with us," Caroline ordered her daughter, gesturing disdainfully toward Penelope, who stood silently in the corner, her face obscured by the heavy black veil. "Mother, absolutely not. She'll embarrass me," Charlotte whined. "Nonsense," Caroline replied with a wicked smile. "Contrast, my darling. When Alexander sees you next to that grotesque, veiled monstrosity, your beauty will shine 100 times brighter. She will stand in the shadows, hold your train, and fetch your drinks. Let the immortal Lord see the standard of perfection you offer, contrasted with the absolute dregs of humanity." Penelope's hands trembled beneath her apron. She had heard the whispers of what happened at Covington Keep. People went in, and sometimes they never came out. But she had no choice. She was trapped in the Vale, trapped in the manor, and now trapped in a dangerous game of immortals. The night of October 24th was bitterly cold. A dense, unnatural fog rolled off the Oxfordshire hills, swallowing the tires of the Winslow family's Bentley as it crawled up the winding, torchlit driveway of Covington Keep. Penelope sat rigidly in the back, squeezed beside Charlotte's voluminous crimson skirts. Penelope herself was dressed in a drab, ill-fitting charcoal servant's dress, her thick black veil securely pinned to her hair. Her heart hammered against her ribs. For the past 3 weeks, she had secretly stopped using Dr. Aris's ointment entirely, substituting it with a plain aloe vera lotion Maria had sneaked into her room. Beneath the veil, her face felt entirely different, smooth and painless, but she still believed she was a monster. The psychological scars ran far deeper than the physical ones. The great oak doors of the keep were pushed open by towering men with impossibly pale skin and golden eyes. The grand ballroom was a masterpiece of terrifying opulence. Chandeliers made of sharpened obsidian hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a dim, flickering candlelight over the crowd. The room was packed with the global elite, Russian oligarchs, British lords, Hollywood executives, all offering up their daughters, who stood shivering in silk dresses, trying to catch the eyes of the predatory, impeccably dressed immortals who circled the room. Penelope stayed glued to the marble wall, clutching the edges of Charlotte's heavy train. The air in the room was suffocating, thick with the scent of expensive perfume, old money, and an underlying metallic tang of blood. Charlotte was in her element. She strutted through the crowd, laughing loudly, flashing her diamonds, and aggressively positioning herself near the grand staircase, where the Vampire King was expected to make his entrance. Penelope kept her head down, trying to be invisible. But invisibility is a luxury the cruel rarely allow. A group of high society heiresses, led by the viciously wealthy Victoria Sterling, noticed Penelope lurking behind Charlotte. "Good God, Charlotte," Victoria sneered, sipping a dark red liquid from a crystal flute. "What is that thing? Following you? Did you bring a beekeeper to the gala?" The surrounding aristocrats chuckled. Charlotte flipped her blonde hair, a practiced look of mock sympathy crossing her features. "Oh, don't be cruel, Victoria. It's my cousin, Penelope. She was horribly disfigured in a fire. Mother and I took pity on her. We let her out of the house occasionally to feel normal, though obviously she must keep her hideousness covered so as not to cause a panic. "How charitable of you," an Italian count murmured, looking at Penelope with blatant disgust. "Though one wonders why you'd bring a gargoyle to a beauty pageant." Tears pricked Penelope's eyes beneath the dark lace. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing the marble floor would swallow her whole. In a sudden, mean-spirited impulse to show off for the crowd, Charlotte turned and sharply yanked her train out of Penelope's hands. "Stand back, Penelope! You're stepping on the silk! You clumsy, useless freak!" Charlotte hissed, shoving Penelope hard in the chest. Caught off guard, Penelope stumbled backward. Her heel caught on the edge of a heavy Persian rug, and she crashed hard to the floor, knocking over a towering silver tray of champagne glasses. The deafening crash echoed through the cavernous ballroom. Silence instantly fell over the hundreds of guests. The music stopped. Penelope lay on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass, her hands bleeding from the shards. She scrambled to pull her veil down, terrified it had slipped. The crowd stared at her, an ocean of hostile, mocking eyes. Aunt Caroline looked ready to murder her. Then, the temperature in the room plummeted. The shadows in the corners of the ballroom seemed to stretch and crawl toward the grand staircase. "The king," someone whispered in breathless terror. At the top of the sweeping obsidian staircase stood Alexander Covington. He was breathtakingly lethal. Standing well over 6 feet tall, he wore a tailored, midnight blue suit that seemed to absorb the light. His hair was dark and swept back, and his eyes, a striking glowing amber, swept over the silent crowd. The sheer force of his aura forced several human billionaires to involuntarily drop to their knees. He began to descend the stairs. His movements were fluid, totally silent, like a panther stalking through a jungle. Charlotte immediately puffed out her chest, stepping forward to intercept him, arranging her face into a sultry, inviting smile. "My Lord Covington," Charlotte purred, dropping into a deep curtsy. "I am Charlotte Winslow. It is an absolute honor to—" Alexander didn't even look at her. He walked right past her, his gaze locked entirely on the shattered glass and the trembling girl in the black veil trying to push herself off the floor. Charlotte's face flushed crimson with humiliation. The crowd held its breath. Had the servant girl's clumsy display offended the immortal lord? Was he going to kill her right there on the marble floor? Alexander stopped inches from Penelope. He looked down at her bleeding hands, and then, slowly, his amber eyes locked onto the black lace, obscuring her face. He didn't smell fear. He didn't smell a grotesque chemical burn. He smelled something that made his dead heart seize in his chest. A scent of rain, white lilac, and ancient, pure magic. A scent he hadn't experienced in over 500 years. "Get up!" Alexander's voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Penelope was paralyzed with terror. She couldn't move. Suddenly, Alexander knelt down into the shattered glass, completely unbothered by the shards digging into his expensive trousers. He reached out with a hand adorned in heavy silver rings and gently grasped her chin. His touch was freezing cold, yet it sent an electric shock straight through Penelope's veins. "My lord, forgive her!" Aunt Caroline suddenly shrieked, pushing her way to the front of the crowd, terrified the Covington wrath would fall on the Winslow family. "She is a deformed imbecile, a monster! Please allow my guards to throw the creature out so you may look upon my beautiful Charlotte." Alexander did not break his gaze from the veil. He simply raised one finger in Caroline's direction. The air pressure in the room violently shifted, and Caroline was suddenly slammed backward against a stone pillar by an invisible force, gasping for breath. "You speak of monsters, mortal," Alexander whispered, his voice dangerously soft. "Yet you do not know what you have kept in your attic." With painstaking slowness, Alexander gripped the hem of the thick black lace. Penelope flinched, squeezing her eyes shut, preparing for the inevitable screams of horror from the crowd, preparing for the vampire king to recoil in disgust. He pulled the veil away. It fluttered to the bloody glass below. For a moment, there was a heavy, suffocating silence in the ballroom. No one screamed. No one gasped in horror. Penelope slowly opened her eyes. She expected to see revulsion on the face of the immortal king. Instead, Alexander Covington had stopped breathing entirely. His amber eyes were wide, dilated, and filled with a profound, shattering shock. He stared at her face, his mouth slightly parted, his hands actually trembling as he reached up to brush a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The crowd behind them erupted into a collective, stunned gasp. Not of horror, but of pure, unadulterated awe. Because Penelope Winslow was not deformed, the absence of the toxic ointment had allowed her skin to heal completely. Under the dim chandelier light, she possessed an ethereal, heart-breakingly perfect beauty. Her skin was like flawless porcelain, her eyes a striking, luminescent violet, and her cheekbones high and aristocratic. She was, without a shadow of a doubt, the most staggeringly beautiful woman in the room. Charlotte, seeing the face of the cousin she had tormented for a decade, dropped her champagne flute. It shattered, but no one looked at her. Alexander's thumb traced Penelope's jawline, his glowing eyes filling with something that looked dangerously like tears. He leaned in close, so only she could hear the words that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her tragic life. "It took you so long to find your way back to me," the vampire king whispered, his voice breaking with centuries of grief. "My queen." The silence in the grand ballroom of Covington Keep was so absolute, so suffocating, that the only sound was the frantic beating of human hearts and the hiss of wax dripping from the obsidian chandeliers. Penelope knelt among the shattered champagne flutes, her trembling hands still held gently in the freezing, powerful grip of Alexander Covington. She stared up into his glowing amber eyes, her mind completely short-circuiting. "My queen." The words echoed in the cavernous space, impossible and terrifying. Penelope instinctively reached a bleeding hand up to her own face. For 14 years, she had felt tight, leathery, scarred tissue beneath her fingertips. Tonight, she felt only the soft, smooth curve of her own cheek. She looked down at the puddle of spilled champagne on the marble floor. In the distorted, liquid reflection, a stranger stared back at her. A woman with striking violet eyes and aristocratic features. A woman who was undeniably, breathtakingly beautiful. "It's a trick!" Aunt Caroline's shrill, panicked voice shattered the quiet. She was still pinned against the stone pillar by Alexander's invisible force, her face purple with exertion. "She is a deformed witch, a monstrosity. She has cast a glamour over your eyes, my lord. Put the veil back on the creature." Alexander slowly rose to his full, towering height, bringing Penelope up with him. He positioned her safely behind his broad shoulders, shielding her from the predatory stares of the immortal court. When he turned to look at Caroline Winslow, the air in the room grew so cold that frost began to form on the edges of the crystal glasses. "A glamour," Alexander repeated, his voice a lethal, vibrating purr. "Is that what you paid Dr. Henry Aris to tell you?" At the mention of the doctor's name, a balding man in a tuxedo near the back doors suddenly turned and sprinted for the exit. He didn't make it 3 steps. 2 of Alexander's golden-eyed guards materialized out of the shadows, grabbing Dr. Aris by the collar and dragging him unceremoniously to the center of the ballroom, throwing him onto the glass-strewn floor at the king's feet. "You mortals are so delightfully arrogant," Alexander sneered, looking down at the trembling doctor. "You thought you could hide her from me forever. You thought your pathetic chemical concoctions could suppress the bloodline of the first immortal sovereign." He turned his gaze back to the horrified aristocrats, his voice booming with absolute authority. For over a decade, This family has kept my reincarnated bride locked in a drafty attic. The fire in 2004 that killed Thomas and Mary Winslow was no accident. It was paid for by Caroline, executed by human mercenaries to eliminate the only people who knew Penelope's true lineage. But the child survived. And so, to steal her vast inheritance and keep her hidden from my sight, Caroline employed this disgraced alchemist. Alexander pointed a sharp, silver-ringed finger at Dr. Aris. The ointment he prescribed was never meant to heal burns. It was a highly toxic, dark magic suppression compound. It was designed to temporarily blister the skin, to mask her ethereal scent, and to suppress the awakening of her immortal memories. As long as she applied it daily, she appeared deformed. The moment she stopped. Alexander turned back to Penelope, his expression softening instantly as he looked at her flawless face. The illusion melted away, revealing the perfection that has belonged to me since the Tudor courts of 1512. Charlotte Winslow looked like she was going to be physically sick. Her expensive crimson dress suddenly looked tacky and pathetic next to Penelope's tragic, understated beauty. "No," Charlotte stammered, backing away, tears of furious jealousy ruining her expensive makeup. "No, she was my maid. She scrubbed my floors. She is nothing." "She is everything," Alexander corrected, stepping closer to Penelope. He gently rested his cold fingers against her temples. "You have suffered in the dark for so long, my love. Let me give you back the light. Let me give you back your mind." As his fingers pressed into her skin, a rush of blinding, agonizing heat surged through Penelope's veins. She gasped, arching her back as a dam broke inside her consciousness. Memories that did not belong to the abused orphan of Oxfordshire flooded her brain. She saw herself in gowns of velvet and spun gold, walking the halls of a much older Covington keep. She saw herself riding a black stallion through a misty forest, laughing as a dark-haired, amber-eyed lord chased her through the pines. She remembered the taste of copper, the thrill of the night, and the devastating, crushing grief of being assassinated by a rival coven in the winter of 1514. She remembered dying in Alexander's arms, promising she would find her way back to him in another life, no matter how many centuries it took. Penelope opened her eyes. The violet irises now glowed with a faint, dangerous luminescence. The timid, trembling girl who had walked into the ballroom was dead. In her place stood the ancient, sovereign queen of the immortal world. She looked past Alexander, her gaze locking onto her Aunt Caroline and her cousin Charlotte. The terror in their eyes was exquisite. "Aunt Caroline," Penelope spoke, and her voice was no longer a quiet, broken whisper. It resonated with power, echoing off the stone walls. "I believe you have some of my property." The ensuing judgment was swift, brutal, and flawlessly executed, as only a vampire court could manage. The Covington Estate's private legal team, a ruthless firm of immortal lawyers operating out of London's financial district, was summoned immediately. By midnight, while the gala's guests watched in stunned, terrified silence, the entire Winslow fortune was legally dismantled. Alexander did not simply kill Caroline and Charlotte. To a vampire, death was a mercy, a quick release from consequence. Alexander preferred poetic, agonizing justice. Alaric Pendleton, the corrupt estate lawyer who had helped Caroline steal Penelope's inheritance in 2004, was dragged from his bed in London and brought to the keep. Under the threat of having his blood drained slowly over a week, Pendleton signed the confessions, authorized the transfer of the stolen millions back into Penelope's name, and surrendered the deeds to the Winslow Manor. "You stripped her of her dignity, her beauty, and her freedom," Penelope said coldly, sitting beside Alexander on a magnificent throne of carved obsidian that had been brought into the ballroom. She was no longer wearing the scratchy charcoal servant's dress. Alexander's attendants had draped her in a sweeping gown of midnight silk. "You convinced me I was a monster," You made me fear my own reflection." Caroline wept, begging on her knees, her expensive jewelry clinking against the cold floor. "Penelope, please, we are blood. I took you in." "You took me hostage," Penelope corrected sharply. She leaned forward, her glowing violet eyes pinning her aunt to the spot. "I am stripping you of the only things you value, your wealth, your status, and your pride. The Winslow Manor is mine. Your bank accounts are mine. The clothes on your back belong to me." Alexander raised a hand, signaling his guards. "Take them to the kitchens. They are to be given the lowest quarters in the sub-basement of the keep. They will scrub the stone floors, they will wash the iron pots, and they will do it for the remainder of their miserable mortal lives." Charlotte let out a blood-curdling scream as two towering vampires grabbed her by the arms. "No, you can't do this to me. I am a socialite. I am meant to be a queen." "You are a scullery maid," Alexander corrected, with a cruel smirk. "And to ensure you focus on your work, I am having all mirrors removed from your quarters. You will never look upon your own face again. You will only have the memory of what you once were, slowly fading away in the dark." The screams of Caroline and Charlotte echoed down the grand hallways as they were dragged into the depths of Covington Keep, a fitting end for the women who had subjected Penelope to the exact same psychological torture. As for Dr. Henry Arris, his fate was much quieter, but infinitely worse. He was handed over to the Covington alchemists, eager to test their own flesh-burning, experimental potions on a willing human subject. He was never seen in the mortal world again. The cover-up in the human world was a masterpiece of bureaucratic manipulation. If you were to search the Oxfordshire County Council records for November 2018, you would find a neatly filed death certificate for Penelope Winslow, claiming she tragically succumbed to complications from her childhood injuries. Aunt Caroline and Charlotte Winslow officially relocated to a private retreat in Switzerland, supposedly suffering from intense grief, abandoning their high society lives entirely. The estate of Winslow Manor was quietly absorbed by a shell corporation owned by Covington Enterprises. The public moved on, the socialites found new dramas to gossip about, and the gargoyle of Oxfordshire faded into a dark, whispered local myth. But behind the heavy iron gates of Covington Keep, a new era had dawned. Penelope stood on the grand stone balcony of the master suite, the cold November wind whipping her dark hair around her shoulders. She looked out over the sprawling, misty hills of the English countryside, finally free from the heavy black veil, free from the agonizing burns, and free from the chains of a fabricated, tragic life. She felt a cold, strong chest press against her back, and thick, muscular arms wrap securely around her waist. Alexander rested his chin on her shoulder, breathing in the scent of white lilac and ancient magic that had finally returned to him. "The court is waiting for your first decree, my queen," Alexander murmured, pressing a soft, freezing kiss to the sensitive skin of her neck. Penelope smiled, a genuine, powerful expression that lit up the night. She turned her head, capturing the vampire king's lips in a kiss that promised centuries of unbreakable reign. The monster of the attic was dead. The queen had finally come home. If you ever find yourself driving through the misty hills of Oxfordshire and see the iron gates of Covington Keep, remember the girl in the black veil. True beauty and power can never stay hidden in the dark forever. If this story of brutal revenge and immortal romance captivated you, smash that like button, share it with a fellow drama lover, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable true-life mysteries.